Perfect. We can probably get started. We have 6 tuning in remote. And then here. So I guess we'll start off. So I'm Andrew Verbencore. I am a partner and head of design here at Headway. So I'll be walking through using components in Figma. As we mentioned last time, Figma is something we switched to probably just about a year ago and kind of went all in with it with one of our clients out in San Francisco, working remote. Definitely increases the transparency that we have and decreases a lot of the back and forth time of PDFs or PSDs, things like that. But yeah, so today's goal, excuse me, today's goal is to kind of go through both of these page designs and start designing them out. Billy has hired me to design out his website. So we'll just be reproducing this with some components, and this will be kind of the final version. So just to recap for those that don't know or weren't here on last time, on the left side, the left panel here, we have basically just the layer panel, and then on the right side we have the UI that gives us all the styles and all of the different capabilities for changing attributes and things like that. And also one question before we got started here was, how does the output look? And so you can kind of highlight certain elements and go to code on the right side and be able to export different font families and things like that. Also some prototyping tools that we'll get into next session, but we'll kind of stay inside of this design layer for now. So before we get started, any questions from last time? Anyone had? No. Does everyone have Figma installed? Just waiting for, so yes. Cool, so we'll get started with using components in Figma here. So one thing I like to do, and this is really a preference thing, by default you get this light canvas. I like to just kind of change the background to black immediately. I think it helps with contrast. It really depends on what you're using, but really helps you focus on what the design is. So with Figma, there's a bunch of different types of styles that we'll get into, and you can see here there's currently no local styles, whereas if I go into this intro to Figma, you can see that we have textiles, we have color styles, we also have a grid style. And these are things that are basically stored and are variables that we can pull into the design throughout. So as we build up the UI kit and a design system, we really have one point of reference similar to how you would if you're using styled components in a programming sense. Which really helps to cut down on different types of miscommunications. Hey, this button's one shade off. You didn't mean it to be. When you get to really complex apps where we have hundreds of screens, really limits the time to tweak and update things. Excuse me. So we'll get started with colors. And so one of the shortcuts for like a circle is just O. So you can create a circle pretty easily there. And I'm just going to reference Billy's design to be able to pull up the actual color so that next time as we pick up, it'll look just like what we're doing there. So the first color that we'll create is going to be a gray. And it's just going to be a hex value of 9F, 9F, kind of all the way across. And so right now, this is just a gray color, a gray circle here. There's really no way for me to reproduce this throughout the design unless I were to paste that over and over and I'd reference back. So the big thing about Figma, it kind of creates this color style, as I mentioned, where I can click into here and then hit plus, and I can just assign this a color name. So we'll just call it gray.
So Andrew, that's a SVG graphic on your canvas?
It is an SVG graphic. You can export it PNG, JPEG, SVG, or PDF, but it is math-based vector in its current format. And so you can just reproduce this a couple times, and we'll kind of speed through this color portion here. The next color we'll make is somewhat of a black. Kind of best practice is there's no true blacks that should be kind of in your screen. So we usually use like a charcoal gray for a lot of our stuff that we intend to be black, since it doesn't really render black. Kind of helps with some color options down the road when you get into typography and text and things like that. So you can see here, I've reproduced this circle, and it still has the color style that we just set. So I can just break that apart by detaching it, and I can create another code style or color style. And so this one we'll name, we will name Black-ish. And then
If
we'll,
you didn't detach it, it would have applied that.
if I,
Artboard.
yep, so you can see here that these ones are based on this color. So if I come into the color panel here and go to the properties, so I can change it here and it'll detach it, but if I go to this edit style, that goes to really the root where that color is defined. So I would come here and I would change it, and you can see that things start to change as I change the style of that. So same thing here, we'll just detach these. And then we'll assign a warm white color of F2E9 E9. So that's got a little bit of a red tint to it. And I'll create the style. And we'll kind of go with this like red orange as an accent, you'll see. And then a burnt orange, so a little bit darker we'll use as like a hover state or a state throughout, just to indicate change for the user. And we'll call that burnt orange. So now we've got our color palettes, or I guess our colors defined out inside of this file. I'm just going to drop these back into our components. So one thing that Figma doesn't do yet, I don't know what their plans are, but when you create a component in Sketch, what they'll do is they have a symbol panel that will automatically take the master and apply it to that Sketch page on the left here. With Figma, it really just leaves it where you have it, wherever you create it. So if you're creating components inside of a file that is calling a different design system, you'll run into some issues, because it's going to create it local to your file and not a design system file. So we won't go into shared libraries or design systems quite yet, but maybe we'll go into that after if people are interested. So basically, you want to create things inside of a component library or create them inside of this design page and then port them back into the components just so you can organize those. So you can see here, if we go to the design and click, we start to see which local styles we have defined. So we have color styles, we can see the grays, all the colors we just created. We don't have any other local styles defined. So as we go through the process here of creating these components and styles, we'll start to see those pop up and become available to us. So the other thing we'll go into right now, I guess any questions before we go beyond colors? Looks like no. Okay, so we'll go into text styles next. And so if we look at Billy's file here, we can see we have a couple different text styles. As it comes to navigation, we have a header style. We also have some body copy here. So let's actually jump forward to the design. And we'll create basically the artboard. We talked through artboards last time, but an artboard is essentially a canvas that you can export and it'll clip and kind of outline the content that's inside of it. for all intents and purposes, it's like a frame of your design. And so when you hit A, as a keyboard shortcut, you'll get this tool set on the right here that allows you to select one of the preset options. So for us, a lot of things. Sorry, what was it?
Question about eyedropper. Is there an eyedropper?
On color, there is an eyedropper. So if we go to the component panel here, and let's create a new one. Let's break it apart. So if you select the color panel here, it'll give you this hex color selector, and then you can eyedrop to anything inside of here.
So you could import a photo and do samples off of it?
Yep, yeah, exactly. So you could go, it kind of has a weird workaround for photos. You can either drag them in, you can copy and paste them in, or you can basically add them to an image. So just like, and developers will be probably more familiar with this, but you can contain images inside of an element like this where it'll be flexible, and so it's called fill inside of here, but it's essentially the contain property for a background image. You can also select fit, which is basically the cover image was the fit. The cover image was the fill. The fit is more of the contain property inside of CSS. But yeah, so you could pull this in here, and let's say you wanted this green, then you'd be able to select whatever color you wanted outside of that. Any other ones? Or is that just Aaron's? Okay, perfect. So we'll keep going. So what I was saying about hitting A, that is a shortcut for Artboard, and it allows you to select one of these presets. So they have like social images on there. They have different paper sizes that translate to pixels if you're designing for the watch, Apple Watch, or anything on desktop here. We typically design out a little bit larger because in prototype mode, it gives us the flexibility to scale down. So we usually design out for extra large screens. So here's a desktop at 1440 by 1024. But typically we'll design at 1600 wide to account for HD and then be able to scale that down. And the way that Figma does components, you'll see how easy it is for us to go from desktop to tablet to mobile using the same components and be able to scale those down. So the first thing we'll want to do here is establish a grid. And so we'll just call this home. And the shortcut to just rename any layer that you have selected is Command R. That's kind of just for rename. And then one thing that will be helpful for you since you weren't here and anyone that wasn't here last time is you have this shortcut panel in the bottom right, this question mark. You can pull them up and start to see which shortcuts you do use, which ones you don't use, and be able to really start to optimize your workflow. So all of the ones in blue are the ones I use typically. The other ones I haven't necessarily used. There's also some plugins that are coming out now that help you to create your own shortcuts and things like that that'll help speed up your process. So the first thing we're going to do is create a grid on here so we know where we're placing things. We typically use a 12-column grid for anything that's a website or a web application. And so you can see there's no grid styles here, but that's one of the other things that you can use over and over. So if your grid changes at some point, it's really pointing back to this one source of truth that helps you update all of your screens. So they have a couple options. Grid, it's displayed as a grid. They have columns, they have rows. Sometimes we use columns and rows depending on baseline grids and things like that. But for this sample, we'll just use columns.
Can you import standards like Bootstrap or something like that?
You could. So what we've done, with some of our design systems. So we have boilerplates that we create with all of these components, and then you can set them. And so if you start with a library, you basically have all of these styles out of the gate. So you would have all of these styles here. You'd have this grid style, so you could set it in one place. That's like a template file, reproduce that file, or point it back to it, create a design system out of it, and then be able to have those standards. And you can name those, Bootstrap, Foundation, Material UI, whatever you're using. So you can see here, we're kind of adhering to the grid in this example. I'm just going to grab those grid properties quick. Looks like we actually created it with a 16 column grid. Yeah.
No consistency.
But we'll roll with it. Or we'll roll with 12 for now.
What size was your screen?
1600, so just change the width of that. And then we have, it's a 14, is it 1440 or what? I guess 128. So here you can see that we've set a grid, but it's not a grid style yet. So you just have to remember, either set the property and then be able to click this grid style or this icon that brings up the grid styles, and then hit create style. And then it takes those same properties, and now I can name it 12 column, not 16. So then you can see here on any screen as you're working on it, see what type of grid you're using. Really helpful for development to be able to see those things at a glance in those styles. Any questions with that getting set up right now? Pretty straightforward.
Would you set your margins at?
It is 64, so then that'll be the margin on the left and the right. And you have a couple different options here, which is nice. A lot of places you have to, other tools you have to specifically have it set from the left and then position it. But you can do a center, and then you can say, hey, I want these to be 84. I want my gutters to actually be, or let's do 88. I want my gutters to be 32. You can kind of create your grid and say, I want it centered. For a lot of things that we work on, we might have a left navigation panel, so we'll set it left aligned, and then the offset is just from the left. So if we had, for example, an icon panel or something on the left here, we'd want to set our grid and adjust it to account for that. So we'd set it to the left, and then we'd be able to start our grid beyond that. And that's really depends. There's two ways that you could do it. You could have it be part of the grid, so you could have it be stretched and then have no margin. But in that scenario, you would want, let's say you wanted it to stretch all the way. Maybe, here we go. If you wanted your navigation to be part of the grid, it could be a column or 2 columns, and then be able to, design your application from there. Perfect. So now that we have our grid set up, we'll go ahead and create. We'll create the navigation element. So in this example, or in the desired state, you can see we have this navigation block. And that's put together in one spot and then reused, throughout all the rest of the screen. So if we go back, one quick way to go to the master component of that is basically right-clicking, and you can say go to master component, and that'll take you back. Kind of indicator of whether or not something is a master component is this block is either 4 elements or 1. So here we can see that this is really just an instance of that component, and it's not the master. So I can make minimal edits to this, like I can update copy overwrite that from a component standpoint. I can change the color of things, and those will persist even if I change the root component. So you're gonna have to be careful there. And one example here is if I change this to house, you can see this next layer is only home. Since they're instances of that component, it does allow me to overwrite that. But if I go back to the master component here and I change home to Little House on the Prairie, and I come back to my design, the one that I changed to house persists, and well, it should in theory, unless it was changed. It should overwrite back. It's a different, what did you say? Okay. Gotcha. So let me just duplicate this, and then, so what Billy was saying is it's not actually going to overwrite, because what we're doing here, and we'll get into this in the prototyping phase, but we're switching the state of this button. So this button has a shared template, which gives us the layout of the text and the state, this button to let us know that it's selected. And since it's not the selected state, it doesn't show up right. But if I move it to selected, and then let's do it on this one. So if I reset the instance, and it's as if I didn't change anything, wherever this would be throughout the site, would change to whatever this copy change was. So let's try it again. Change it to tiny home. You can see here this changes to tiny home as well. And so it becomes really powerful when you use components for, like Jacob leads up our marketing team, and we have different resources and libraries we've created for them to be able to create their own items. So when we have an event like today, he can put the content and the title of the event, and it'll kind of roll out to 15 or 20 different graphics that our team doesn't have to get involved. So something we'll do with our clients, we don't do marketing for them, but we'll help them set up these systems that empower them to create more content, kind of create some layouts to be able to really roll that out and empower their team to not have to be technical and come in and change things in a lot of places.
So how many states are there? Are there 3 or just 2?
There's 3 right now, because and one thing that we'll get into shortly here is you have I'm trying to think where the template state is. Yeah, so we have hover, normal, and selected. So these are things that we'll get into shortly here, but you can set it to normal, meaning that nothing is happening. We can set it to hover, where it just shows you a different color, and then you can set it to selected. So as you get into prototyping and you have multiple screens, you really have this one header layout, and then you're just modifying the state of it, essentially by selecting a different instance. So here we'll select it back to normal, and you see that it kind of works that way. So we'll reset both of these instances, meaning that it's going to go back to whatever state this main component is at. So now it automatically goes back to this state. And so if you are overwriting content on a lot of screens and you accidentally hit that, I would suggest to undo it right away. It'll create some problems. But if you don't change anything, as I mentioned in that context of, you have one root component with a bunch of different variations for Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, that sort of thing. If you don't change the copy specifically and just kind of change the styling or the sizing of it, you'll be able to really persist that same content throughout all of your blocks. So we'll go back here and just switch this to home. And you'll see it says home both places. And then we'll just change the states here again from home. This one is now normal since we're on the work page. And then we'll change work to selected. So now what we'll do is actually create that navigation element. And so one thing you can do since you're in the same file is create it inside of, inside of your workspace. So basically you're going to create a rectangle if you like, and that'll become kind of like your height margins for that component. And it's just gray right now for us to see where that's at. And then one tip that I like to do is, sometimes you want to see the grid, sometimes you'd like to hide it. Like right now, it's kind of in the way. I kind of go in and out. I don't know really if you have a preference on grids or anything like that. Like when you see them or not. Kind of as you work, you have the ability to just control and hit G, and then it'll be able to turn that on and off as you're working through a file. You might get
You keep grids on in the UI kit, and then in the actual design area,
Yeah.
you manually turn them all off.
So we're going to bring in Billy's name, and I guess a good thing that you could do. So the shortcut to create it is T. So if you hit T, it'll enter a text element for you. You type in, as we go through this, you could type in your own name, or you could go, you could create a portfolio for Billy as well. And then we're going to change, bless you. We're going to change the alignment to left, and then just align it to the top of the grid here, or to the left of this grid. And so we don't have a textile on here, and you can tell because it shows us just the raw attributes and values here. So I think that's coming in from our Headway system. So let me hide that. So you can see here we have a design system already called Headway Design, and we'll just hide that so we don't see that anywhere. But you can see here now we don't have any textiles, and that's where I talked about before, creating those external libraries that can kind of cascade down through all of your files as it's a starter kit or as something that really gives you a jumping off point to be able to hop in here and instead of reproducing the wheel with each project, have a good starter base where you have all of your different attributes defined, and then you can adjust them from there. So we'll just go ahead and create, we're just using Roboto Bold 12 on this, and we'll just go ahead and create a textile. And we will name it H3. This probably should be an H1 for SEO. And so one of the other things you'll notice too is we're not using, as we select it here, we're not using the same color, or we're not using a color from the library. So as I mentioned before, instead of using straight blacks, we'll use something that's blackish. So I'll go and select that. And now I can see, that I'm using an H1 style and I'm using black. And so this is all part of the design system, so that as things would change in the future, we'll be able to roll it back.
So Andrew, you named that style H1, and so that becomes the H1 style?
It's really, it's not in stone. I mean, so as I mentioned, there are APIs that'll help you pull those out and give you like a textile sheet with all the CSS and things like that. We just name it because it gives us kind of hierarchy. But yeah, like
So if you look at the code that's generating it, it's not necessarily an H1.
yeah, it'll give you, so this is the layer panel, and I don't know if I can zoom in, I can. But in the top right here, you can see it gives me what the text was. So this is really helpful if you're in here and you're coming, into your style sheet or something to be able to paste it. You could see that, oh, this was Billy Sweetman, text, or if I type something else, like this lorem ipsum. It kind of just gives me context of what text was in there.
So it's giving you everything you need to do.
Yeah, it'll give you the text. So hey, here's your CSS, and then if you need to fill it with it's a static site or something, you're not pulling in something dynamic, be able to just pop that text in there as well.
Cool.
All right, so so now we've got our H1. In there, we're going to go ahead and create our the navigation elements that you saw. And so we'll pull that in. So we need home. We'll go ahead and break that apart from from that H1, and we'll just name this navigation. And so now it creates another style called navigation that this is assigned to. We can come in here to edit the properties of that, and we'll kind of bump that up to 16. And so as you saw in the other file here, we really have this tap target. It's kind of large, and so we're going to create that element by, it can either contain it in a box, or I can convert this to a component right here. And then I can modify the width of that component by holding Command. So if I don't hold Command or anything in scaling, it'll just make the box bigger. Guess let's get a background on there as well. And so now I have this tap target, and if I were to fill in text that's longer than this home button, just name it navigation. So if I hold Command, as I was saying earlier, and then I can start to grow it as much as I like, and that really becomes a tap target. So as you go into prototyping, instead of having just the home text, you'll be able to click anywhere on this area for this component. One of the things we'll also want to do for the component is, right now with the text the way it is, if I use this component and I duplicate it, I think it'll keep the same width. Kind of lets me grow. Do you know why that is, Billy?
What's that?
Why it lets?
Because by default, the textile, I think, is set to auto scale width. So if you set it to fixed on your primary component, set that to fixed, it should. Let's see little dots.
Yeah. There it is. So yeah, as Billy mentioned, it's set to width, so it'll automatically resize the width or the height, or be fixed. And so when you're setting these components up, you can see as I manipulate this inside of the component, it stretches with it. And so that's important as we get to scalability of these elements. And so you can do things like creating tap targets inside of here, or let's say you had some rules inside of your inside of these files where you wanted a specific where you wanted specific padding and margin on either side, you could create a guide inside of here and then be able to turn that on or off. And so oftentimes we'll do that with like icons and stuff. We'll create tap targets and then be able to create a replaceable icon inside of that. And so you can see our text is currently left aligned. And so not necessarily applicable to, we're not going to grow this element specifically since it is a header element. But when you get to buttons and multiple lines of buttons, it's, I guess, more important because then you can have multi-line text. You keep kind of the integrity of the header, padding and whatnot. So we're going to go ahead and center this in the middle, vertically centered, and then we're going to go ahead and also, so I'm just selecting the home layer, and then I'm also selecting the bounding box layer. We're going to set that to center, and so you can see the text is left aligned, so it stays there, but when I when I select text align center, it'll go ahead and do that for me. And so now as once I lock these items to, these guides to the bounding box by selecting the right, it'll bound this box to the right of the tap target. And then I say top and bottom means it'll stretch up and down. And I do that for both sides, except this would be the left and the top and bottom. And then this will just be the top. Left and right, meaning it'll scale this way, and then top, meaning it'll stay at the top. And then on this one, we're going to keep it left and right as well, and then also bound it to the bottom. So as I use this instance, it grows with it. So in the example I mentioned before, where you had a button that was a tap target, it would allow you to make sure you keep those margins consistent throughout. So in this case, the top and bottom aren't necessarily that useful. But here, let's say we had a specific, padding in between, the sides of the text we wanted to keep. We'd be able to create this header nav, in this fashion where we're making sure we're having, if it was just padding, we would just have one element, but you might have margin and padding. So if you wanted those to stack together, you could see, how accurate it would be making sure those are consistent. And then you can just turn those guides off if you want. Just turn those guides off once you get into that prototyping phase. So here we have a navigation element, and we're gonna, since we've kind of laid it out in this fashion, we're gonna copy that over to the components area. Actually, sorry, why don't we step back to just creating a component out of the header navigation now. So just select everything that's up top, and we'll go ahead and Command G, and that'll create a group. And then we'll create a component out of that.
So Andrew, if you were gonna add like hover and active states, you'd do that before you save it onto the component?
You don't have to. I'm just gonna do it since we're far enough along here. You could do it either way. I mean, if you know exactly where it's gonna be, I think the reality is a lot of designers are kind of designing as they go and figuring out what looks good. So you might wanna design ahead and then decide on something and then kind of roll that back out to it. But if, you know, in this case, if you're looking at something specific that you wanna duplicate or it's an existing product that you're working on, you might be fine just creating a component right away. I think as early as you can create a component, the better, because then you can make sure that you're cascading all the changes throughout the different screens.
Is there a reason why you're creating a group and not a frame? It's because it's a component?
If you create a component, it automatically becomes a frame. Right?
Yeah.
So, well, no, I want to make sure I was right. I know there was a question last time. But yeah.
Because I'm on the anti-group,
Right, that's what I
on
was
the
wondering.
anti-group train, just frame everything.
Yeah, so even though I created a group, it converted that group into a component.
But you don't actually have to create a group, right? You can just highlight it
Yeah,
and
I didn't know the
right-click,
shortcut.
create component, or-
Yeah, you could highlight it and right click, yeah. And so here, we're using the master component, so we'll just go ahead and roll that back to this component sheet. One quick way, if you are working in a file and then are rolling it back to the component sheet, is you can duplicate it, but the one that gets duplicated is an instance, and that automatically gets highlighted. So just want to make sure you're not selecting that one.
If you wanted to do drop-down menus, would you add that as a hover state?
Yeah, so you can do things like, and Bill, you'll get into that next time, where you can do overlays. So you can basically call up an overlay anywhere onto the frame. You can place it manually, and that'll be like relative to a button or to a tap target, or it could be centered automatically with like a opacity if you're doing modals and things.
You can get really fancy and have elements outside of your component. So your drop down, so you're just changing the same shape out, and then your drop down is going beyond the bounds of your component.
So we'll get back into the grid elements here. So you can see there's no layout grid, but I can apply a grid to a component that's outside of that file. So when I was in the file, I had the luxury of the grid inside of it. Here we don't. So we're just gonna go ahead and align it to the grid. And then I'm gonna align, take this away. I'm going to align this so that there's specific padding between these two elements. And let's say there was a margin, you know, of 16 as well. And that you might want to do that for different reasons. You know, when you get to mobile, you might want it to be a little bit different as things start to stack.
Aaron has a question. Question from Aaron. So you build out UI system of components in a separate page, and then the component icon in the lower left just becomes a component library?
You can, yes. So if you're importing a design library as well, they'll appear in this component sheet. If you create it, you know, any of your components will basically show up there. As you get into hundreds and potentially thousands of components, you will have to search for them, and that's, you know, fairly easy. The funny thing is, though, is as you get lots of these files, it'll actually search for components in different libraries that you're not using in here. So you have to be sure that you're bringing in the right component, or it might start to link in some of those elements.
Also helps with organization, because if your components are floating around in your design, it's hard to go find them.
Yeah, I mean, a big, like a quick backfall is as you get used to working with Figma is if you not sure where a parent component is, you can hit go to master component, and if by accident you've deleted it, so I'll just go ahead and delete this one. So it no longer exists in the file, but it exists in the component library. I can hit restore master component, and then it'll plop it in for me, and then that's my master. We'll just go ahead and move that again back into this file. And so here we have 2 pages, home and work, and I'll duplicate these just for, so we can see the changes as we make them. So now our next task here is to create, also change this back to white since we're not working inside that tap target anymore. You can see here it started to cascade out the changes already. And I'm going to put a background on this just so we can see it. And also hide the guides just because they're a little ugly. So what I want to do to create a new version or a new state is just duplicate this navigation item. And like I said before, it selects the same one automatically. But so here I want to create another component. And what that is doing is that's creating a nested component of it. And I want to name that, let's say, I guess selected. This is the state.
So you're making a component of a component.
Right, and so the nested component gives me the ability, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to change this state to a burnt orange, but then be able to control the layout using the first component. And so we're using components that basically set the layout and structure, and then we're wrapping that component in another one to make the changes that we're going to use throughout. Otherwise, those would get overridden. So home. We also have not that. We also have this centered bullet for the selected items. And so what we'll want to do here is make sure that we're using the color from the design system and then center that and then put it on the bottom. So as we would scale out these elements, we move to navigation selected. As we scale out this element, it stays centered with inside our button there. So that's good. We'll go ahead and create another component based off our base one. We'll name that navigation/hover. And then I believe we're going to switch this to the orange state. Let's take a quick look. Yeah, we're going to switch this to that more orange state. And then we need one more state. So the reason we want a normal state is for us to be able to make those changes to the navigation component, but without changing the structure of it, so that if something does change about the core structure of the button or the tap target, it inherits that. So we have all 3 states covered from that standpoint. And sorry, one thing I need to do here is I didn't make a component of that style. So we have navigation/hover. We'll rename this to navigation/normal or static. And then we'll create a component of that. So one change we do have to make here is change it to this gray. And so we now have these components. These 3 are nested components, meaning that it contains another component, which is this root. we have the navigation component that contains only 2 instances, but we have the ability on both of these screens to change the instances. And so you can come up with a ton of variations just by your naming conventions. And so here, if I go into design layer here, I can see anything that has the root of navigation slash. So if you go back to the components, we named all of those navigation slash normal slash selected slash hover. That gives us organization in here, because then we can, since it's in the same folder structure, it gives us the ability to swap that instance with anything. And so we can do a normal, we can do a hover state, we can do a selected state, and start to go through this process really easily. And so since we want our home component to be the default, we'll change this to the normal, since it was previously set to what we created as the root. And so that'll cascade throughout all of these. And so as you get into the prototyping phase, it becomes easier to create those prototypes and different user flows without having to create lots and lots of screens and variations and be able to manage those things. Any questions on that process? Not a. Sorry, what was that?
Nothing from the chat.
Oh, okay. So the next thing that we'll do here is go into, if we look back to Billy's page design, we have some text. So right now we have both of these elements. Spacing is a little bit different. Looks like we went to 2 columns there. And so if we want to change that here, we'll just create the grid. We'll be able to, since we made all those adjustments before, be able to just adjust this grid width, align that, and it gives us these handy little guides. And then since we already componentized everything, instead of having to make those changes again and again, we can see they parented throughout wherever we made it. And so it gives us the ability to react to changes really quickly. You can see here, though, we do get a double grid just because it's turned on inside the component. Oops. But you can go ahead and before you duplicate it, you can either turn it off specifically here, somewhere. Or is that just at the artboard level? Billy, do you remember? To change the screen off?
If you do it at the artboard, or if you do it in the component, it'll turn it off here. But if you turn off the grid here,
It'll
it'll keep it on in the component page.
Gotcha. So one thing looking back here, we have, this is actually the H1, that's the H3. So we have Billy Sweetman that we'll bring over. And we'll use the 12 column grid and not the 16 column. You can see here automatically it's using the last style that I used. So it's nice as you start to add a lot of content, it'll kind of default, but just something to be mindful of that we'll want to break that up. And so we'll go ahead and create, we're going to call a hero text. And then just make that a bit larger here. So there's 2 ways. You can either create a text style right away, or you could go into, as designers, as I mentioned before, we kind of mess around with something until we feel like it looks good. You can get it the way you want it and then create the text style from there. But we'll go in here into this panel and we'll 32. And then we'll make the default style to blackish. We also have some body text that we can create a style on. And then we can make modifications to this file or to this text inside of it. Actually, let me show. So here we're just calling out links inside of a text block, and unfortunately they don't have the ability to, well, I guess we could, Billy, in this file, did you go through like a text, like a body link style at all? Okay. So we have this body text here, and it's going to be that color by default. Actually, we don't have that much time, so we'll go to that. But you could create, you can essentially bring in styles into here. It's actually the same. So you can create styles inside of a text block and have multiple styles inside of that. So the thing that I was going to walk us through is you can have a body, a style of body copy that's one color, and you can have a body/link that'll give you a link color. So then you would just select the text that you wanted to be the link, and then you'd be able to kind of inverse it that, or if it was underlined or something, be able to give you the ability to customize as you go. Yeah, so we have the navigation, we have kind of these body styles here with the hero. We've got it doesn't give me the ability though to overwrite it if it's multiple text styles, so I have to go in and then so if you wanted to change all of that, it gives you some trouble, some collision control saying that, hey, you have multiple styles in here. You can't really just select a style to overwrite it. I feel like that changed recently. I feel like you could select anything and be able to change it, but I'm sure there's a reason for it.
So you can't select the whole block and change it to one style?
If there's multiple styles in it, yeah, it kind of lets you know, hey, you had 2 styles in here. Are you sure? And kind of, it's a little bit of a workaround to be able to do that, to get it the way you want it. So in this example, we have now a button as well. And so really going to go through the same process of creating a base button and then be able to customize it for a hover state and then a selected state. So does anyone remember the process for that? No? Anyone want to take a stab?
Create a component, then you make a component out of a component. And you replicate that second component. That's why.
Would you start with a frame?
Could. Remember, when you make it a component, it'll automatically turn it to a frame. So either way, I'm just referencing the sizing just so that if we get to the next session, it looks mostly familiar. And then as a reminder, we have this panel in the top right that controls a radius. And so we have a 4-pixel button. So this one's is just using a random color. We want it to use our color style. So we'll go ahead and put that in there. And then by hitting T, we'll be able to put in information. We have body by default. We'll leave that in there. And so part of that process as well that we went through is we want to center the button just in case we make some updates to it. We have, instead of contact, we have change it to contact me, for coffee or whatever. You'll be able to expand and use that same button. One other thing that we do here in this panel is control the text alignment to center. So you can, if you remember in the last one, we would align this with the grid or the guides on the side. So if we wanted 8 pixel padding on the left, 8 pixel on the right, 16 on top, something like that, be able to align this box. And then as you were to duplicate it, you could have multiple lines of text and it would center that for you right in the design. So we're going to go ahead and create a component out of that. And we're going to name it button. And then we're going to create another component. Static. We'll create component. Duplicate that. We'll create a hover state button. And I believe the text was white. So we'll change this to white. You can see since we didn't change any of those other ones yet, it's still using the same colors. But as soon as I were to override it for static or hover, it won't change to the default button unless I were to roll it back and basically reset the instance. And I'm just going to get the button style in here quick. So we're going to change that to button style.
So I have a question from Jeff real quick.
Okay.
Where does an instance come into play after creating a component?
As soon as you duplicate a component, it produces an instance of that component for you. So we'll go ahead and edit this button text to be medium, 10 pixels, and then we've got some letter spacing in here. And then we'll go ahead and make sure it's linked appropriately. We want it to scale left and right and top and bottom as well. So then it'll be attached to that. So you can see it keeps the button nice and centered if we were to have larger buttons or larger tap targets. And then looking at our states here, we have, sorry, was there a question? No. Got a couple different states here. And so contact for the static button, we'll leave it that color. For the hover, just like the header, we will hit it with an orange. And then for this last one, we'll rename it to button/selected. And that'll really just be like a on-click state. But to give some feedback to the user, we'll create that burnt orange, sorry. Once I make sure it's a component, then I can edit it. And now we'll create that burnt orange. And so to get that component into here, I can either copy and paste it. I can go to this layer panel, and I can see here, as I hover, I get the name of that button. So remember, I don't want the root button. That's really the structural, that's what every button's based out of. So I want the button/static or normal, whatever you call it. I can hit Control G, and that'll create, show me where the grids are inside of this. And then, so if I were going to create a prototype, which we'll kind of get into next time, I'll be able to select this as a hover state. And so when I hover over that element, it'll swap it quick for me, the images together to be able to do that. But manage the state of these just like the other navigation elements that we walked through. And then the next thing we have is, for Billy's site, we gotta drop a photo in there.
Got a quick question from Aaron here. Is it safe to say you never use root components in the actual layouts, just the instances?
It is. It is. I mean, if you're doing something quick and dirty and you're not really using it, you probably don't need to create a component, but you might out of habit as you start working with them. But yeah, I would always make sure you're using an instance of a component if you're set on that component. Sometimes we might, like we did a design sprint as a team on an internal product we're working on, where we had 4 designers in there, and we had one person create the root component, and then we duplicated that and pulled it in, knowing that, hey, these are kind of the placeholders where this is going to go inside of the app, and then we updated that root component later. So that was kind of inside of a screen. So basically, if you wanted to create this screen first and have all the root components, you could, and then roll them back. The issue you run into, as I mentioned before, with master components, if you're using a library, is that when you copy and paste them to that library, they will break. In most cases, I think we've seen some inconsistencies and don't really know what the rules are exactly when you're pasting between a file back to a master component. So sometimes we might design in here without making a component, copy the layers and everything, and then if we had a design system that we were working off of, we would paste it in there and then make it a component there. So as you get into nested components where you have this as a root button and then you're creating your states off of there, you want to make sure you're doing that inside of the design library if you have one, because it will allow you to create a new component, but as you paste it back in there, it'll basically break everything apart, and then you'll have to start over and say, hey, I want this button as the main, and then make your edits. Was that helpful, Aaron? Perfect. So we have Billy's photo in here. It's inside of, I won't really go through that component, but so it's inside of basically a shape layer. And so as you paste in images, you'll see that they just automatically default to shapes. And so back to what I was mentioning before, they have fill, which will basically be your background cover for those of you that know front-end development. Fit will be basically that contain where it would fit it to the container. Crop will be where you can control exactly how you want it. So you can start to manipulate the photo inside of it. And then you would export this, and that's exactly what would export. It would export the cropped container. And then the other element here is just tile, where it would tile the image throughout. And so if you had, if it was 2001 and you were tiling a background or something, you could do that and then it'd be tiled. You can do the same thing. What was that? Yeah, you're the man now, dog.
Does it give any kind of resolution warnings?
It does not. It does not. But so one good application for this, for scaling is if you creating a marketing site and you're maintaining image ratios throughout. So you're doing a 3:2 ratio for all your images, or you have 2 different styles. You can create guides or basically create a component that has an image inside of it so that when you go outside of it, it shows you the color or things like that. So you're basically making sure that you're keeping consistent, and then as you export those images, they're exporting at the right ratio if you're not using contain or cover or things like that. So we'll just put this back to fill. And then the next part that should be fairly quick. Be kind of the last thing that we'll run through here. I guess any questions before we continue, or any more questions?
Yeah, Aaron's got a question. What about exporting 1x, 2x, and 3x? Can you speak to how Figma handles resolution a little?
Sure. Yeah. So you can just export just like you can in Sketch. If you just keep clicking, it'll go ahead and do your 1x, 2x, 3x for you. You can have different. I'm trying to think how they handle different defaults, but you can basically export, however you want up to, I think we've done 50x before. I haven't really found a limit for it. It does slow down quite a bit. But today you're probably exporting a lot of SVGs, which is usually, just, it could be multiple X just to be larger at the native scale. Otherwise, if you're exporting things for iOS and Android applications, you'll use PNGs and things like that for 1x, 2x, 3x. I don't think they have as good of handling as Sketch does for that. They usually had presets where you'd have, you basically have suffixes behind each of the elements where it'd be, icon at HD4, different things like that tells the application which images to use. So a lot of that they don't necessarily have as part of this, or haven't had experience with. Have you run into that at all, Billy, on any of the projects lately?
No, like the prefixes in the actual name.
Yeah.
Export, so just to handle that.
Yeah, so if I name this export here, right now it'd be rectangle.png. If I named it Billy Sweetman, it would be, Billy Sweetman at 123 PNG. I just copy this. And so on. And so with these suffixes here, they'll just be appended to the back end of them. You'll just want to make sure that if you do change it in the left panel here, the right panel, is reflective of what it actually is. And then when you hit remove, it'll remove from the top down. Any other questions there, Aaron? All good. Perfect. We'll create one more component real quick, and then we'll wrap up, and then we'll save the rest for next time. So we're going to go ahead and create a component inside of here just to show you a little bit of that workflow. I believe it's just single. So we have 4 columns across, or 4 items across. We'll want to make them 3 columns each. And then let's go ahead and make these squares. .356 by 356. You can see it's a little bit off because we're not using the 16 column grid. We'll go back down to 353. And so this will serve as like the base for what we want to do, and we're creating these elements. So basically we have a text here, we have a year, and then we have a background image as well as a, I think this is like a fade top to bottom to just increase the readability of the text. And so we'll want to bring in an image, and so we can either drag and drop it in there, or we can go to image for the fill of that layer, and then it'll just go ahead and bring in those items to us. And it brings it in right here as a fill. If we want it to, as I mentioned, to fit, we can do that. If we want to crop it, we can do that. We'll just bring it in. We'll just bring it in this way. So we start with image. So now we just have a rectangle. We can make it a group or just create a component right away. We'll go ahead and create that component. And then we do have that kind of subtle gradient over the top. And so to do that, you can just create a shape. R is for rectangle, and that'll allow you to create a rectangle. Just give you the selector to click and drag. We'll go ahead and come to the fill here, and since we don't have a gradient for it, we'll want to switch it from solid to linear, and it kind of gives us if you're familiar with other tools, it gives you, a very similar tool to be able to see where the gradient is impacting, what the direction is, and then what the two attributes or two colors are of that. And so we'll want to change both to black. You can see here that it kind of fades this one to 0 by default. You could increase the opacity or decrease it if you wanted.
As long as you're working on top of the component, it reads that as elements that are part of that component. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. And so if you try to delete something out of an instance, it'll just hide it for that instance. So you can hit delete. So one example is in this component, if I go to, say I want to delete this, it just hides it. It won't actually let me delete it out of that component because it's tied to something else. So it'll just hide it for me. Same thing with this text. If I want to delete it, it'll just hide it and just disable it inside that layer. And so real quick here, we'll just add a name to it. Right now, as I mentioned, since I was just clicking on that navigation element, tries to guess what I'd like to do. It automatically puts a navigation style in there. So we'll just go ahead and create one more style and break this apart. We'll default it to white. Probably too large. And so this one we'll want to pin to left and top. It's left and top by default, so unless you have elements on the right, you shouldn't have to change it. And then we'll put the year in here as well and create a new component for that, or a new textile, sorry. And so just to show you how this works, if you have things that are grouped and you use that folder structure, just like you could for button/hover, button/selected, it starts to group them for you. So it shows you, rather than scanning through all of it, you could have like header/h1, and then it would start to separate those for you in the file. So here you can see card, and then it shows me the card title and the card year, and allows me to go from there. So since this is the component, I'm going to duplicate it so it creates an instance on top of it. Why don't we actually name this card first, and then we'll duplicate it. We'll copy this card back over to the component layer. And so now I have an instance of this that I can start to duplicate and start to carry through. So I can start to lay out, and one thing it'll do is if you duplicate it and move it, and then you duplicate it again, it'll automatically move it the number of pixels you moved it before. So then you can really just start to, do things fairly quickly as you move down. And so now we have a grid of all of these elements, some that are clipped by the content, and or by the bounding box. And if you want to see those as you're working, you can just hit uncheck clip content, and that'll allow you to go through that process. and just kind of, see everything that's inside of that frame. So just like we did, with editing these elements, we can change this to, we can change this background image to another project. Same thing on this one. And we'll just delete these since we don't have all of those, or we don't have all of those projects in. So now you can see that you have this grid of elements that's propped up by this main component. And I think we'll save, there's going to be a couple states of this card that we'll go into in prototyping, and we'll save that for next time. But you can see here, if I decided, hey, I like this, but I kind of want to move it to the bottom, and flip this around, move that to the bottom. I can do that, and it just happens throughout all of the components. And so it really cuts down, you can get, like I said, you can get these in place and then be able to go back to the components, change it there, and really not worry about all the busy work that no one enjoys. And then, one thing for developers is it creates that consistency where it's never 1 pixel off, it's never 10 pixels up, unless you were to start sizing things differently. Really creates a lot of clarity, between the handoff on design and development, and then making sure that we're, really just have that one source of truth for each element. That's really all we had today. Any questions or thoughts before we wrap up?
Nice.
Looks like once you're familiar with it, it's really quick.
Yeah, if you can remember most of the stuff, it's easy. I was on vacation for last week, so I just got back.
What do you guys think of the learning curve? How long did it take you to become where you're actually doing your true production?
I mean, so if you've used Sketch before, it's really similar. The learning curve's pretty low. If you haven't, I think it's a little bit more if you're coming from Photoshop or something like that, just because Photoshop was created more for photo manipulation, and they kind of added some UI tools into it. Sketch came out as primarily a UX UI tool, and then they started to add more features that were synchronous or congruent with Sketch. So if you use Sketch, it's it's going to be very similar to you if you've used something else that isn't primarily like a UI tool. It'd be a little bit steeper, but I think they've done a really good job of decluttering a lot of the interface and really reducing the options that you have. So you don't have to use components. You know what I mean? You can just come in here and just design something out without using components. It definitely speeds up, the workflow. So we do a lot of like healthcare and fintech applications that we have hundreds and hundreds of screens. And there's a whole methodology around forking. How do we preserve a prototype in time so that it doesn't live on with, with the design system as we make changes in the future. Might be doing a usability test or something that we want to preserve the state of it. So that stuff gets more advanced, and you have to kind of learn the ins and outs of it. But I would say if you're using this tool every day, I would say max a week. If you're, once you start working through this process, it becomes easier. And, when you don't do it right and you want to change something, it'll let you know because it won't update. And then you'll be like, oh yeah, I forgot to do that. And I think there's really good support around it, which is why, we wanted to hold this and kind of just show you types of tools that we're seeing and we're using, because no one wants to reproduce, hey, I made this change, now I have to go make it 30 more times. Our clients aren't paying us for that, right? They're paying us for more of the thought strategy work. And so if we can cut down on this, we can focus more on, the bottom line value and things. So I would say give it a shot. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot them over either on the meetup group or the message board there, or just reach out to us directly. And then it is free for, I think, 3 projects. So you can't create design libraries with the free version. So it's kind of why we're staying away from that in case anyone wanted to get their feet wet. But if you have questions on that, we have some links that we could definitely share. Perfect. Well, thank you all. This will be recorded and on YouTube.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone that's tuning in remote. We will see you in a month.
Thanks, Andrew.